Imagine the narrow, cobbled streets of medieval Kilkenny. The year is 1324. The air is heavy with incense from the church, mingled with the pungent scent of market stalls selling salted fish, herbs, and wool. Beneath the shadow of the looming cathedral, whispers circulate, not of trade or taxes, but of something darker. The name on everyone's lips is Alice Kyteler. She is no ordinary woman. Wealthy, charismatic, and surrounded by scandal, Alice has already outlived 4 husbands, each death more suspicious than the last. Some call her a murderer. Others say she is a sorceress who consorted with demons. And yet, she was never burned, never broken on the wheel. Unlike so many accused of witchcraft, Alice did the unthinkable. She escaped. Welcome, my friend, to this long, whispered journey into the life and legend of Alice Kyteler, the woman remembered as Ireland's first recorded witch. Before we unravel her story of power, persecution, and survival, I'd love for you to take a moment to subscribe. This channel is where forgotten histories and haunting tales come alive. Your support helps keep these stories whispered into the night. So settle in, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's step back into a time of medieval superstition, where wealth, gender, and whispers of witchcraft could decide your fate. Tonight, we follow Alice Kyteler, a woman whose life was caught between the power of gold and the fire of the church. To understand Alice Kyteler, we must first understand the world she lived in. Ireland in the early 14th century was a land of 2 peoples and 2 laws. On one side, the Gaelic Irish, with their ancient traditions, clan loyalty, and bardic culture. On the other, the Anglo-Normans, descendants of Norman invaders, who had carved out wealthy estates and brought with them the customs of England and continental Europe. Between them lay tension, cultural, political, and spiritual. In the bustling town of Kilkenny, where Alice lived, this tension was palpable. The streets were lined with stone houses of merchants, taverns filled with gossiping voices, and churches where priests thundered about sin and salvation. It was a place where wealth could buy comfort, but it could not always buy safety. And for women, the rules were especially harsh. A woman's life was expected to be one of obedience. Obedience to father, husband, and above all, the church. Patriarchal values meant that personal desires, especially those of women, were restrained, sometimes brutally. Divorce was nearly impossible. Marriage was binding, with very few reasons for annulment. The prolonged absence of a spouse, impotence, or the breaking of a pre-marriage contract. If Alice ever wanted to leave her husband's, the law gave her no freedom to do so. Layer onto this the shadow of religious fear. The church in Ireland warned constantly against sin, greed, lust, pride, and especially sorcery. Open displays of sexuality were not just frowned upon, but condemned as sinful, even damnable. To even think of such acts was believed to endanger your soul. Masturbation, desire outside of wedlock, even an unusual closeness between women could draw suspicion. This was the Ireland Alice Kyteler moved through, a wealthy woman in a society that mistrusted women with power, a widow several times over in a culture that whispered of curses and potions, and a figure who straddled 2 worlds, Anglo-Norman prosperity and Irish suspicion. It was the perfect stage for accusations of witchcraft to take root, and Alice, with her fortunes, her marriages, and her mysteries, was an irresistible target. Alice Kyteler was born into privilege around the year 1280 in Kilkenny. Her family were Anglo-Norman settlers, part of that powerful minority who had carved out wealth and influence in Ireland. Unlike the native Gaelic Irish, the Anglo-Normans lived in stone houses, kept ledgers of their finances, and mingled in trade networks that stretched back to England and even to the continent. From the very beginning, Alice lived in a world where money and power mattered. She grew up with access to education, refinement, and connections, advantages that set her apart from most women of her time. While most women were expected to quietly serve their households, Alice learned to navigate the world of wealth. She understood commerce, property, and the language of contracts. Her life would soon be marked by her marriages, 4 in total, each one to a wealthy man. With every union, Alice's fortune grew, and with every husband's death, her reputation darkened. The first marriage brought her stability and wealth, but when her husband died, people whispered. The second marriage ended in another sudden death, and the murmurs grew louder. By the third, the rumors had become a shadow, trailing her wherever she went. And by the fourth, there was no denying it. Alice Kyteler had outlived 4 men, and in a society steeped in superstition, that alone was enough to cast suspicion. But it wasn't only her widowhood that made her notorious. Alice was not the meek, silent widow that custom demanded. She displayed her wealth openly. She managed her household with authority. She spoke her mind, and she wielded a kind of influence that made men uneasy, to the church, to jealous neighbors, and even to her husband's children from previous marriages. Alice was a dangerous figure. A woman who controlled money, property, and perhaps, if the whispers were to be believed, darker powers. Her rise to wealth was not just the story of fortune, but the story of resentment. Because in a world where women were supposed to be silent and obedient, Alice Kyteler was neither, and that would make her enemies. Her first husband was William Outlaw, a wealthy merchant of Kilkenny. This marriage secured Alice's place among the elite of the town. William's fortune and trade connections gave Alice access to more wealth than most women could ever dream of. When William died, Alice inherited a substantial portion of his assets. Nothing was proven, and indeed, nothing may have been suspicious at all. But his death planted the first seed. A wealthy widow in her 20s was unusual enough. But Alice would not remain unmarried for long. Her second husband was Adam LeBlond, another prosperous man. His sudden decline in health and death again brought Alice into widowhood, and again enriched her. In medieval society, sudden illness was common, and yet the fact that Alice now had buried 2 wealthy husbands raised more than a few eyebrows. Whispers stirred in taverns and marketplaces. Was Alice simply unlucky, or was she somehow orchestrating her fortune? Her third husband was Richard de Ledrede, a landowner of note. By this point, Alice had already attracted suspicion. When Richard too fell ill and died, the rumors hardened into near certainty among her rivals and stepchildren. People muttered about potions, powders, and whispered incantations. Some claimed she had enchanted him, draining his health. And yet, nothing was ever proven in court. It was her fourth marriage, however, that truly lit the fire of scandal. Her final husband was Sir John Power, a knight. John's death was not only sudden, it was highly contested. His relatives accused Alice of poisoning him, of scheming to take control of his fortune. Unlike the earlier marriages, here the accusations were loud, formal, and dangerous. One of the most damning claims was that John himself, before his death, believed he had been bewitched, that Alice had given him strange powders, and that his health wasted away because of her. When he died, his family was determined to see justice done, not only in defense of John's honor, but also, perhaps, in defense of their inheritance. 4 husbands, 4 fortunes, 4 deaths. Alone, each could be explained. Together, they painted a pattern that was too tempting for enemies to ignore. And remember, this was a world where medicine was primitive, superstition was strong, and women with power were feared. Alice was not just any widow. She was a wealthy, outspoken woman who did not fit the mold. It was only a matter of time before the whispers of poison and witchcraft would reach the ears of the church. Into Alice Kyteler's world stepped a man whose shadow would loom over her story, Richard de Ledrede, the Bishop of Ossory. He was an English Franciscan friar, appointed bishop in Kilkenny in 1317. Stern, zealous, and utterly devoted to the authority of the church, Richard arrived in Ireland at a time when accusations of heresy and witchcraft were gaining strength in Europe. While Ireland had its own folk traditions and superstitions, it had not yet seen the kind of organized witch hunts that swept through France or Germany. Bishop Ledrede intended to change that. From the beginning, he clashed with the wealthy Anglo-Norman elite in Kilkenny and Alice Kyteler, with her fortune, independence, and suspiciously long list of dead husbands, was the perfect target. When Sir John Lou Power's family accused Alice of witchcraft, Bishop Ledrede seized the opportunity. Here was a chance to root out heresy, to assert his authority over a community that often resisted his control, and perhaps even to make an example of the most notorious woman in Kilkenny. Ledrede was not a man to proceed quietly. He launched a formal inquisition into Alice's life, gathering testimonies from her enemies, her stepchildren, and those willing to speak against her. What began as family grievances and whispered suspicions quickly hardened into a legal case of heresy, sorcery, and even dealings with demons. The accusations were lurid. It was said that Alice had sacrificed animals to demons, that she had made potions from foul ingredients, and that she consorted with a spirit named Robin Artist's son, her supposed demonic lover. She was accused of using charms and powders to bewitch her husbands, of gaining wealth through unholy means, and of teaching others in her household to follow the path of sorcery. For Bishop Ledrede, this was about more than Alice alone. It was about stamping the authority of the church over the laity, about showing that even the wealthy and powerful were not beyond God's law. By targeting Alice, he sent a message: no fortune, no name, no family connections could protect those who defied the church. But Alice Kyteler was no simple peasant woman. She had allies, influence, and wealth, and she was not about to surrender quietly. The stage was now set for one of the most infamous witch trials in Irish history. The accusations against Alice Kyteler were unlike anything Ireland had seen before. Bishop Richard de Ledrede framed them not as petty quarrels or inheritance disputes, but as a case of outright heresy and sorcery, crimes against God himself. The charges were read out with chilling detail. Alice was accused of denying the Christian faith, of sacrificing animals to demons, and of using magic powders and ointments to harm her husbands. She was said to have gathered her followers in secret, teaching them spells and charms. The bishop even claimed she had a demon lover, a shadowy figure named Robin Artist's son, who appeared in the form of a black dog or a mysterious man. Most damning were the so-called objects of witchcraft discovered in her home. Investigators claimed to have found herbs, powders, and a pipe containing ointment hidden in her room. Some argued that this pipe was more than it appeared, that it was in fact a dildo, a shocking suggestion in a society that condemned even the thought of sexual pleasure outside of marriage. If true, it suggested something scandalous, that Alice was unashamed of her own sexuality, that she was willing to defy the rigid sexual morality of medieval Ireland. In a time when open displays of sexuality were sinful, even dangerous, such a discovery painted her not only as a witch, but as a woman of scandalous appetites. The church used this to paint her as doubly corrupt, body and soul. To the patriarchal values of the time, a woman who pursued her own pleasure was already dangerous. A wealthy widow who may have murdered her husbands to gain freedom and fortune, that was monstrous. And yet, beneath all the lurid claims, there was another layer. Remember, Alice's stepchildren, especially from her final husband, Sir John Lou Power, stood to gain enormously from her downfall. If she were convicted of heresy, her fortune would not pass to her chosen heir, William Outlaw Jr., her son from her first marriage. Instead, it could be seized by the church or claimed by rivals. So what was truly on trial here? Was it witchcraft? Or was it inheritance, power, and the freedom of a woman who refused to bow to the rules of men? The trial dragged on, with testimony from servants, neighbors, and family. Under the bishop's hand, even the smallest suspicion became evidence of sorcery. Alice's maid, Petronilla de Meath, was arrested, interrogated, and eventually tortured. Under unbearable pain, she confessed to everything, to mixing potions, to following Alice's teachings, to watching her mistress consort with demons. Petronilla's confession sealed the case. In the eyes of the church, Alice Kyteler was Ireland's first witch. But Alice herself? She was not waiting around for judgment. By the time Bishop Ledrede had assembled his charges and wrung a confession out of Petronilla de Meath, Alice knew the walls were closing in. The accusations were too strong, the evidence too damning, and the church too determined to make an example of her. But Alice Kyteler was not a woman to go meekly to the stake. She had wealth, she had connections, and she had cunning. The details of her escape remain shrouded in mystery. What we know is that sometime in 1324, before a final judgment could be pronounced, Alice vanished from Kilkenny. Some say she fled to England, returning to the land of her Anglo-Norman roots. Others believe she disappeared into the Irish countryside, protected by allies who resented the bishop's heavy hand. What is certain is that she never appeared in Kilkenny again. Her disappearance was both humiliating and infuriating for Bishop Ledrede. He had promised the community a witch's punishment, a fiery display of the church's authority. Instead, his accused slipped through his fingers. And before we continue, let me take just a brief pause to say, if you're still with me, thank you. These long, whispered journeys into hidden history take time and care to create. And if you're enjoying this, I'd love for you to subscribe. It helps this channel grow, and it ensures that stories like Alice Kyteler's continue to be told in the quiet hours of the night. Now, let's return to Alice, because her trial was not only about her. It was also about those around her, especially the woman who would pay the ultimate price. In her absence, the full fury of the church fell on those left behind. Petronilla de Meath, Alice's maid and confidant, paid the ultimate price. She was burned at the stake before a crowd in Kilkenny, the first known woman in Ireland to suffer that fate. Her screams and the smoke that rose from her body were meant as a warning. This is what happens to witches, to heretics, to women who stray from obedience. Alice's son, William Outlaw Jr., was forced to make penance, to atone for his supposed complicity in his mother's heresy. He performed religious duties and paid fines to satisfy the bishop. And Alice? She became a ghost, not in the supernatural sense, but in history. Her story does not reappear in records after her flight. Some say she lived out her life in quiet obscurity. Others whisper she continued her practices in secret, far from Kilkenny's prying eyes. In a way, her vanishing act only deepened her legend. Unlike most accused witches, Alice Kyteler was never burned, never broken, never made into a public spectacle. She escaped the fate that claimed so many women after her. And that escape turned her into something larger than life. Not just Ireland's first accused witch, but also its first witch to outwit the flames. But if her story ended there, we would miss what makes it so compelling. Because beyond the drama of her escape lies the deeper question, who was Alice Kyteler, really? So, was Alice Kyteler truly a murderer, a witch who poisoned her husbands and struck bargains with demons? Or was she something else entirely? A woman trapped by the constraints of her time, desperate for freedom in a society that gave her almost none? Let's look at the world through her eyes. In medieval Ireland, as we've seen, women had almost no power to shape their own destinies. Marriage was binding. Divorce was nearly impossible. Annulments were rare and only granted under very limited conditions. A spouse's prolonged absence, impotence, or the breaking of a marriage contract. If Alice had wanted to leave any of her husbands, the law would not have allowed it. Perhaps, some argue, she found another way. There's also the matter of sexuality. Open displays of sexual desire were scorned in medieval Ireland. To even admit such feelings was considered sinful. Yet, when investigators searched Alice's room, they claimed to have found a pipe with ointment in her nightstand. Some historians suggest this was actually a dildo, a shocking item in a society where pleasure outside of marriage was taboo. If true, it tells us something vital about Alice. She was unafraid of breaking rules, even the most intimate ones. She was comfortable rejecting the standards that told her to be silent, submissive, and chaste. Maybe her husbands didn't satisfy her. Maybe they disapproved of her defiance. Maybe she sought a partner who could match her on her own terms. And in a world that allowed her no such freedom, she took matters into her own hands. From this angle, Alice's story shifts. She is no longer simply a greedy poisoner or a wicked witch. She becomes a woman navigating a world stacked against her. A woman who, in trying to claim control over her life, her body, and her fortune, drew the full wrath of church and society. And here's something to think about. How many of the accusations against Alice were rooted not in fact, but in fear? Fear of a wealthy woman. Fear of female sexuality. Fear of independence in a time when obedience was the only option for most women. It's a haunting thought, isn't it? Now, let's turn to the people who lived closest to Alice, her servants. During the investigations, some of her household staff, likely frightened of being implicated themselves, came forward with chilling testimonies. They claimed that Alice practiced sorcery and that she had a mysterious servant, a shadowy figure named Robin Artist's son, whom they described as her familiar, a demonic spirit in human form. This figure was said to appear to her as a black man, tall and thin, with fiery eyes, sometimes even in the form of a large dog or cat. According to medieval beliefs, a familiar was a supernatural helper, often gifted by the devil himself. To the people of Kilkenny, the idea that Alice had such a companion was proof of her pact with dark forces. The servants accused her of concocting potions, powders, and ointments, some to poison, others to enchant. They spoke of secret midnight rituals and whispered prayers at crossroads, where the veil between the human world and the supernatural was believed to be thin. Of course, we must pause here and remember, these were frightened people pressured by inquisitors. Their testimonies may have been shaped by fear or by the authorities themselves, but their words painted a picture of Alice not just as a scheming woman, but as a dangerous witch who wielded powers far beyond mortal reach. And in the medieval mind, fear was as good as fact. Once a story was whispered, it became truth in the eyes of the crowd. And so, Alice Kyteler, accused witch, wealthy widow, and cunning survivor, vanished into the mist of history. While her name faded from official records, her story refused to die. The trial of Alice Kyteler became Ireland's first recorded witchcraft trial, a grim precedent that showed how fear, religion, and politics could collide to destroy lives. Her escape left others to suffer. Her servant, Petronilla de Meath, was burned alive, the first woman in Ireland executed for witchcraft. Petronilla's cries would echo longer than Alice's silence, a reminder that when the powerful slip away, it is often the powerless who pay the price. But Alice herself remains an enigma. Was she truly a poisoner, a woman who disposed of her husbands to secure wealth and freedom? Or was she a scapegoat, caught in the crosshairs of a bishop eager to stamp out heresy, punished for being a woman too independent, too wealthy, and too unwilling to bow to patriarchal norms? Some see her as Ireland's first feminist rebel, defying the restrictions of her time. Others see her as a clever manipulator who left a trail of bodies behind her. The truth lies buried with her. What we do know is this. Alice Kyteler's story lingers because it captures a timeless struggle. The fight between power and persecution, between those who control the narrative and those who are crushed by it. And maybe, just maybe, that's why her figure still haunts Irish folklore today. A wealthy woman who would not bend, who vanished into the night, leaving only whispers of witchcraft and rebellion. If you stayed with me through this journey, thank you for exploring the life and mystery of Alice Kyteler. Stories like hers remind us how much history is shaped not just by facts, but by fear, by power, and by the stories people choose to tell. If you enjoyed this dive into the past, don't forget to subscribe. It helps bring more forgotten voices and hidden histories back to life. And tell me in the comments, do you think Alice was truly guilty, or was she framed because she lived too boldly for her time? Until next time, sleep well, dream deeply, and remember, history always has more secrets waiting to be uncovered.